When I landed at the London airport, a mysterious man gave me a note from my cheating husband. The vault is empty, crown jewels relocated, castle under new management. I laughed and said, "Tell him I was never the queen, I was the architect." The man looked stunned. "My name is Virginia. I'm 42 years old, and I run the financial operations for Crystwick Digital, one of the fastest-growing cybersecurity firms in Seattle. For the past 18 months, something had been gnawing at me about my husband Timothy. Little things. The way he started checking his phone constantly. How he suddenly needed to work late every Tuesday and Thursday. The cologne that wasn't mine lingering on his shirts. I'm not the type to make accusations without proof. Never have been. In my line of work, you learn to gather data first, analyze patterns, then act. So I watched. I waited. I documented everything with the same methodical precision I brought to corporate fraud investigations. Timothy thought he was being clever about hiding his affair with his assistant Julia. He probably assumed that because I spent my days buried in spreadsheets and security protocols, I was oblivious to what happened outside my office walls. He was wrong about that. Dead wrong. The first red flag came 6 months ago when he started asking casual questions about our joint accounts. How much did we have in savings? What were the access procedures for our investment portfolio? Could I walk him through the process of liquidating our mutual funds? He framed it as wanting to be more involved in our finances, which should have been a good thing. Should have been. But Timothy had never shown interest in money management during our 12 years of marriage. He was content to let me handle everything while he focused on his career as a commercial real estate broker. The sudden curiosity felt forced, like he was reading from a script someone else had written. I started keeping closer tabs on our accounts after that. Not because I suspected theft, but because something in his tone made me uneasy. Call it intuition. Call it professional paranoia. Whatever it was, it kept me checking our financial statements twice a week instead of monthly. The second warning sign was subtler. Timothy began making comments about how tied down we were by our assets. How nice it would be to have more liquid wealth instead of everything locked up in property and long-term investments. He suggested we might want to restructure our holdings, make things more accessible for quick decisions. I nodded along and made non-committal sounds, but internally I was cataloging every word. In cybersecurity, we call this reconnaissance behavior. Someone mapping the terrain before they make their move. Timothy was scouting our financial landscape with the thoroughness of a man planning something specific. The third sign was the most telling. Julia, his assistant, started calling our house more frequently, always with urgent work matters that couldn't wait until morning, always requiring lengthy conversations that Timothy took in his home office with the door closed. The calls happened every Tuesday and Thursday evening, lasting exactly 45 minutes each time. I timed them. Professional habit. When I mentioned the pattern to Timothy, he laughed it off. Said Julia was dealing with some complicated client files and needed guidance. Perfectly reasonable explanation. Except I knew Julia had been working for Timothy's firm for 3 years. She wasn't a rookie who needed hand-holding on basic procedures. I started paying attention to other details. How Timothy's breath smelled like mints when he came home from work, even though he'd never been particularly concerned about dental hygiene before. How he'd developed a sudden interest in upgrading his wardrobe, replacing his comfortable khakis and polo shirts with more expensive dress shirts and designer ties. How he'd started going to the gym 4 days a week instead of his usual weekend routine. All of these changes could have been innocent. Midlife reinvention happens. People decide to take better care of themselves. Careers evolve and require different presentations. But taken together, the modifications painted a picture of a man trying to impress someone new. I could have confronted him directly, could have demanded explanations and confessions. Instead, I did what I do best. I investigated. The business trip to London was Timothy's idea. A real estate conference that would last 5 days, giving him opportunities to network with international clients and explore new market trends. He'd attended similar conferences before, so the concept wasn't unusual. What was unusual was his insistence that I shouldn't come along this time. Previous years, Timothy had always encouraged me to join him on business trips. We'd make mini vacations out of them, extending our stays to explore new cities together. This time, he claimed the schedule would be too demanding for a romantic getaway. Too many early meetings and late networking events. I'd be bored and lonely. Better off staying home. I booked my own flight to London the same day he did. Not to spy on him directly, but to create distance. Sometimes you need physical space to think clearly about a situation that's been consuming your mental energy. Sometimes you need to step away from the daily routine to see patterns you've been too close to notice. The night before my departure, Timothy seemed unusually nervous. He kept asking if I was sure I wanted to travel alone, if I had enough planned activities to keep me busy, if I'd remembered to pack everything I might need. His concern felt performative, like he was saying the words he thought a caring husband should say, while actually hoping I'd change my mind about the trip. I assured him I'd be fine, told him I was looking forward to some solo time to visit museums and explore neighborhoods at my own pace. He relaxed visibly when I said that, which told me everything I needed to know about his real priorities. The flight to London gave me 8 uninterrupted hours to think about my marriage and what I wanted to do next. I'd suspected Timothy's infidelity for months, but suspicion and proof are different things. Suspicion lets you live in denial if you choose to. Proof forces you to make decisions. By the time we landed at Heathrow, I'd made mine. The mysterious man approached me in the baggage claim area. Middle-aged, wearing an expensive suit, carrying himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations. He knew my name, knew my flight details, and handed me the note with practiced efficiency. Reading Timothy's message, I felt something inside me shift. Not heartbreak or betrayal, though those emotions were certainly present. What I felt most strongly was clarity. Timothy had finally shown his hand, and it was exactly what I'd expected it to be. He thought he'd been planning some elaborate financial coup while I was distracted by work and travel. He thought he'd moved our assets beyond my reach while I was literally out of the country. He thought he'd won some game I didn't even know we were playing. He was wrong about all of it. I built my career on understanding how money moves, and how people try to hide it. For 15 years, I'd been tracking digital breadcrumbs left by corporate embezzlers, identity thieves, and sophisticated fraud rings. I knew every trick, every loophole, every method someone might use to quietly transfer assets without leaving obvious traces. Timothy knew what I did for a living, but he'd never really understood it. He saw me as someone who worked with computers and numbers, not someone who specialized in financial detective work. He thought my expertise was limited to corporate settings, not applicable to personal situations. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was assuming I hadn't been preparing for this possibility for months. The truth was, I'd started building safeguards around our assets the moment Timothy began asking those casual questions about our accounts. Not because I wanted to trap him, but because I wanted to protect myself if my suspicions proved correct. I'd seen too many divorce cases where the betrayed spouse discovered their financial security had been demolished while they were focused on saving their marriage. I wasn't going to be one of those people. The legal framework I'd constructed was elegant in its simplicity. Every significant asset we owned was protected by what I called layered access protocols. Timothy could see the accounts, could check balances, could even initiate small transactions. But any attempt to move substantial amounts of money would trigger automatic holds and require dual authorization. He didn't know about the dual authorization requirement, because I'd implemented it through a series of minor account modifications that looked like routine security updates. Banks send notices about policy changes constantly. Most people scan them quickly and file them away. Timothy was definitely most people. The investment accounts were protected differently. I'd restructured our portfolio 6 months ago, moving everything into instruments that required both signatures for liquidation. Timothy had signed the paperwork without reading it carefully, trusting me to handle the technical details as I'd always done. The documents looked like standard rebalancing forms, and I'd presented them during tax season when he was already signing multiple financial documents. Our real estate holdings were the most complex to secure, but also the most important. Timothy's expertise in commercial real estate meant he understood property law better than most people. I couldn't use the same subtle approach I'd employed with our liquid assets. Instead, I had to be more creative. I'd spent 3 months working with a property attorney to establish what we called protective ownership structures. On paper, Timothy and I still owned our properties jointly. In practice, any attempt to sell or mortgage them without my explicit consent would trigger immediate legal challenges that could tie up the transactions for years. The attorney, Elizabeth, had initially been reluctant to help me set up these protections. She worried I was planning something unethical or trying to hide assets from legitimate creditors. I'd had to convince her that I was simply protecting myself from potential financial abuse by showing her the documentation I'd gathered about Timothy's suspicious behavior. Elizabeth was a family law specialist who'd seen dozens of cases where economically vulnerable spouses had been blindsided by partners who'd secretly moved money before filing for divorce. She understood the importance of proactive protection and helped me create safeguards that were completely legal but extremely difficult to circumvent. The irony was that Timothy probably could have overcome most of these obstacles if he'd been honest with me. If he'd come to me 6 months ago and said he was unhappy in our marriage, if he'd suggested we separate our finances in preparation for divorce, I would have worked with him to divide our assets fairly. I'm not vindictive by nature, and I believe in equitable solutions to complicated problems. But he'd chosen deception instead of honesty. He'd chosen to treat me like an obstacle to be overcome, rather than a partner deserving of respect. That choice had consequences he wasn't prepared for. The business trip to London had been Timothy's opportunity to execute whatever plan he'd been developing. With me out of the country, he probably figured he'd have several uninterrupted days to move money, file paperwork, and present me with accomplished facts when I returned home. Classic manipulation strategy. Create a situation where the victim has to accept new realities rather than participate in making decisions. I'd suspected something like this might happen, which was why I'd arranged my own trip to London. I wanted to be in a neutral location when Timothy made his move, somewhere I could think clearly without the emotional weight of being in our shared home. I also wanted to be geographically distant, in case he tried to use my presence as leverage in whatever confrontation he was planning. The mysterious man who'd delivered Timothy's note was clearly a professional courier, probably hired through one of those discreet messenger services that cater to people handling sensitive personal matters. Timothy had wanted to make sure I received his message quickly and dramatically, probably hoping to maximize the psychological impact of learning about his betrayal while I was alone in a foreign country. Another miscalculation on his part. Reading his note, I'd felt several emotions simultaneously. Disappointment that my marriage was officially over. Anger that Timothy had chosen such a cowardly way to end things. Relief that I no longer had to pretend I didn't know what was happening. And underneath all of those feelings, a cold satisfaction that I'd been right to prepare for this exact scenario. Timothy's message had been designed to communicate total victory on his part. The metaphors about vaults and crown jewels and castles were meant to suggest he'd outmaneuvered me completely, that he'd taken control of our shared wealth while I was powerless to stop him. He probably imagined me reading his words and panicking, desperately calling banks and lawyers to assess the damage. Instead, I'd laughed. Actually laughed out loud in the middle of the busy airport, drawing confused looks from other travelers. The courier who'd delivered the message had seemed genuinely shocked by my reaction. He'd probably expected tears or anger, or at least surprise. Laughter wasn't part of the script Timothy had written for this scene. That was when I'd realized Timothy had never understood who I really was. After 12 years of marriage, he still saw me as someone who lived in his shadow, someone whose financial expertise was limited to maintaining the status quo he'd established. He'd never recognized that I was the one who'd actually built and protected our wealth while he focused on his career and, apparently, his affair. I told the courier to inform Timothy that I was never the queen. I was the architect. Then I walked away to collect my luggage, leaving him standing there with his mouth slightly open. The comparison wasn't random. Queens inherit power and lose it when circumstances change. Architects design structures that outlast the people who commissioned them. Timothy thought he'd been planning our financial downfall while I was distracted. In reality, I'd been building a fortress around our assets while he was playing house with Julia. My hotel room overlooked the Thames, and I sat by the window with my laptop, systematically checking every account and investment I'd spent months protecting. Everything was exactly where it should be. Timothy had tried to access our primary savings account, our money market fund, and our joint checking account. Each attempt had triggered the automatic holds I'd programmed into the system. He'd also tried to initiate paperwork for liquidating our mutual funds and selling our rental property in Spokane. Both efforts had been blocked by the legal frameworks Elizabeth and I had constructed. The mutual fund company had sent him forms requiring my notarized signature before any transactions could proceed. The real estate attempt had triggered an immediate call from our property attorney, asking for written confirmation from both owners. I could picture Timothy's growing frustration as each of his carefully planned moves hit unexpected obstacles. He'd probably started his day feeling confident about his strategy, imagining himself systematically emptying our accounts while I was thousands of miles away and completely unaware of what was happening. By afternoon, he would have realized that nothing was working the way he'd expected. I opened my phone and found 27 missed calls from Timothy, all placed within the past 3 hours. No voicemails, which suggested he was too angry or panicked to trust himself to leave coherent messages. The call log showed he'd started dialing my number every 10 minutes, then increased the frequency to every 5 minutes when I didn't answer. I didn't call him back. Instead, I sent a single text message, "Checkmate." Then I turned off my phone and ordered room service. The next morning, I flew back to Seattle. Not because Timothy's plan had forced me to cut my trip short, but because I was ready to finish what he'd started. I'd never been someone who enjoyed conflict, but I also wasn't someone who backed down from necessary confrontations. Timothy had declared war on our marriage and our shared financial future. I was prepared to end that war decisively. The house was empty when I arrived. Timothy's clothes were gone from our bedroom, along with his personal electronics and the few pieces of furniture he'd brought into our marriage. He'd left behind a handwritten note on the kitchen counter, much less dramatic than the message he'd sent through his courier. "Virginia, I know you're angry, but you have to understand that things between us haven't been working for a long time. Julia and I are in love, and we want to build a life together. I tried to handle our financial separation quietly to avoid making this more painful than necessary. I hope we can work out the remaining details through our attorneys without turning this into something ugly. Timothy." I read the note twice, then threw it away. Timothy's version of events was predictably self-serving. He was framing his betrayal as a mutual relationship failure and his attempted financial theft as a considerate gesture designed to minimize my pain. Classic manipulation tactics. Rewrite history to justify unforgivable behavior and present yourself as the reasonable party trying to avoid unnecessary conflict. He'd also managed to avoid taking responsibility for any of his choices. Things between us hadn't been working, as if relationship problems were natural disasters that happened to people, rather than consequences of specific decisions. He tried to handle our financial separation quietly, as if stealing money was a form of courtesy rather than a crime. I spent the afternoon reviewing the damage he'd attempted to inflict. The holds on our accounts would remain in place until I decided to lift them. The legal protections around our real estate holdings meant Timothy couldn't touch those assets without my cooperation. Our investment portfolio was completely secure. Timothy had managed to empty one account, our household checking account, which had contained about $8,000. He'd also taken some cash from the safe in our home office, maybe another $3,000. In the context of our overall wealth, these amounts were insignificant. He'd essentially stolen pocket change while trying to convince himself he'd pulled off a major heist. But the real revelation came when I started examining Timothy's recent financial activity more closely. I'd installed monitoring software on our shared computer months ago, part of my broader effort to understand what he was planning. The software had been tracking his online banking sessions, his email communications, and his web browsing history. What I discovered was worse than simple adultery and attempted theft. Timothy and Julia had been planning their exit strategy for almost a year. They'd opened joint accounts at banks I'd never heard of. They'd researched property rentals in Portland, where Julia's sister lived. They'd even started a small business together, some kind of consulting firm that existed mainly on paper, but was designed to provide legitimate reasons for moving money between accounts. Most damaging of all, Timothy had been slowly draining value from his real estate brokerage clients. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger immediate attention, but a pattern of minor fee padding, commission skimming, and expense manipulation that had probably netted him close to $60,000 over the past 8 months. That money wasn't community property. It was stolen wealth that Timothy had been hiding while planning to abandon our marriage. He'd been building a nest egg for his new life with Julia by cheating his professional clients, then planning to steal our legitimate marital assets as a bonus on his way out the door. I printed every piece of evidence I'd collected and organized it into a comprehensive file. Bank records, email threads, browser histories, accounting irregularities, timeline documentation. Everything a prosecutor would need to build a fraud case against Timothy, and everything a divorce attorney would need to ensure he lost access to any marital assets. But I wasn't ready to involve attorneys or law enforcement yet. Timothy thought he'd been clever about covering his tracks. He thought his plan had failed because of bad luck or poor timing. Not because he'd been systematically outmaneuvered by someone who understood financial crime better than he did. I wanted him to know the truth before other people got involved. I wanted him to understand that his elaborate scheme had been visible to me from the beginning, that every move he'd made had been anticipated and countered. I wanted him to realize that the woman he'd been living with for 12 years was not the naive, dependent person he'd imagined her to be. I wanted Timothy to understand that declaring war on me had been the biggest mistake of his life. He'd sent me a note claiming the castle was under new management. Time to show him who the real ruler had always been. Timothy called me 3 times the morning after I returned from London. I let each call go to voicemail, then listened to his messages while drinking coffee in our kitchen. His tone progressed from confused to frustrated to barely controlled anger. "Virginia, I know you're back. Your car is in the driveway. We need to talk about this situation like adults. Whatever you think you've done to our accounts, it needs to be fixed immediately. Call me back." The second message was less diplomatic. "This is ridiculous. You're acting like a child. I tried to handle our separation professionally, and now you're playing games with our money. I have legal rights to those accounts, and you know it. Call me." The third message revealed his growing desperation. "Look, I get that you're hurt. I understand why you're angry, but freezing our assets isn't going to change anything between us. We still need to work out a fair division of property. Stop being vindictive and call me back so we can resolve this." I deleted all 3 messages without responding. Instead, I called my attorney Elizabeth and asked her to meet me for lunch. We chose a restaurant downtown, far enough from both our offices to ensure privacy. Elizabeth had been handling our family's legal affairs for 2 years, but she'd never seen me in crisis mode before. I wanted her to understand the full scope of what Timothy had attempted. The protections we put in place worked perfectly, I told her over salad. Timothy tried to access every major account and liquidate our investments. Everything was blocked exactly as we designed it. Elizabeth nodded, making notes on her legal pad. "What about the real estate holdings?" "He attempted to initiate sales paperwork for the rental property. Your office contacted him for dual authorization signatures, which stopped the process cold. He also tried to take out a home equity loan against our primary residence. That was blocked too." "Good. The protective structures are functioning as intended." She paused, studying my expression. "But I sense there's more to this story." I spent the next 30 minutes walking Elizabeth through everything I'd discovered about Timothy's extended deception. The evidence of his affair with Julia. The secret business they'd established together. Most importantly, the pattern of professional fraud I'd uncovered through monitoring his online activities. Elizabeth's expression grew increasingly serious as I presented each piece of documentation. "Virginia, what you're describing isn't just marital infidelity. This is systematic financial fraud targeting his clients. That's a criminal matter." I know, but I want to handle this strategically. Timothy thinks his plan failed due to technical difficulties or bad timing. He doesn't realize he's been under surveillance for months. I want to use that advantage. What exactly are you proposing? I outlined my plan. First, I would confront Timothy directly with evidence of his attempted theft from our marital assets. I wanted to gauge his reaction, see if he would admit to his behavior or continue lying. Then, depending on how that conversation went, I would decide whether to involve law enforcement immediately or use the threat of criminal prosecution as leverage in divorce negotiations. The goal isn't revenge, I explained. It's protection. Timothy has shown he's willing to steal from his clients and his wife. I need to make sure he can't do either of those things again. Elizabeth agreed to postpone filing formal divorce papers, while I confronted Timothy directly. She also agreed to prepare criminal referral documents that could be submitted to the district attorney's office if Timothy refused to cooperate with a fair settlement. Be very careful, she warned me. People who've been caught in major lies sometimes become unpredictable. Don't meet with him alone, and don't give him advance warning about what evidence you have. I spent the afternoon preparing for the confrontation. I organized all my documentation into a comprehensive presentation that would demonstrate the scope of Timothy's betrayal clearly and undeniably. Financial records, email screenshots, timeline analyses, evidence of his professional fraud. Everything arranged in chronological order to tell a complete story. I also prepared a written settlement proposal that would allow Timothy to avoid criminal prosecution in exchange for accepting a divorce agreement heavily weighted in my favor. He would walk away with minimal assets, but he would avoid prison time and professional ruin. A reasonable trade-off for someone who'd attempted to steal from multiple victims. Timothy showed up at our house that evening unannounced. I heard his key in the lock around 7:30, followed by his voice calling my name from the front hallway. I'd been expecting this visit. Men like Timothy couldn't tolerate being ignored, especially when their carefully laid plans were falling apart. "We need to talk," he said, finding me in my home office. "This whole situation has gotten out of hand." He looked tired and frustrated, but not yet defeated. He was still operating under the assumption that he could talk his way out of whatever difficulties he was facing, still believing that I was reacting emotionally rather than strategically. "I agree," I said. "We definitely need to talk." I gestured for him to sit in the chair across from my desk, the same chair where he'd signed the financial documents that had unknowingly protected our assets from his theft attempts. He sat down warily, clearly sensing that this conversation wasn't going to go the way he'd planned. "Timothy, I know about Julia." His face went carefully blank. "I don't know what you mean. I know about the affair. I know about your secret business together. I know about the apartments you've been looking at in Portland. I know about the joint bank accounts you opened 6 months ago." He started to protest, but I held up my hand. "I also know about the money you've been stealing from your clients, the fee padding, the commission skimming, the expense manipulation. I have detailed records of every fraudulent transaction over the past 8 months. Timothy's face went white. "Virginia, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly. You've been planning to leave our marriage for almost a year. You've been stealing from your clients to fund your new life with Julia. And you tried to steal our marital assets while I was out of the country." I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward him. "This is the timeline of your criminal activity. These are screenshots of your emails with Julia about hiding money. These are bank records showing the pattern of theft from your brokerage clients." Timothy stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound. He looked like a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. "You can't prove any of this," he finally managed. "I can prove all of it. I've been monitoring your online activity for months. I have digital evidence of every crime you've committed and every lie you've told." I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. The question now is, what we do with this information. Timothy's shock was giving way to anger. "You've been spying on me? In our own home?" I've been protecting myself from a husband who was planning to steal our assets and abandon our marriage. I'd say my precautions were justified. He stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. This is insane. You can't seriously be threatening me with criminal charges over a marital dispute. This isn't a marital dispute, Timothy. This is fraud, theft, and attempted grand larceny. You committed crimes against your clients and against me. Those crimes have consequences. I could see him calculating, trying to figure out how much evidence I actually had, and whether he could discredit it somehow. His real estate training had taught him to look for weaknesses in complex deals, ways to renegotiate terms when initial agreements weren't working out. But this wasn't a real estate transaction. This was criminal law, and Timothy had left a digital trail that any prosecutor would love to follow. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want you to face the consequences of your choices, but I'm willing to offer you a deal." I handed him the settlement proposal Elizabeth and I had prepared. "You accept these divorce terms, you make full restitution to the clients you defrauded, and you cooperate with transferring all hidden assets back to legitimate accounts. In exchange, I don't file criminal charges." Timothy read through the document, his expression growing increasingly hostile. "This is ridiculous. You're trying to take everything. I'm trying to protect what I built while you were stealing from innocent people and planning to abandon our marriage. These terms are completely unfair. No judge would approve this kind of asset division. You're right. Most judges would give you about half of our legitimate marital assets. But most judges wouldn't be deciding your case after reviewing evidence that you're a career criminal who tried to steal everything before filing for divorce." Timothy threw the papers down on my desk. "I need time to think about this. You have 24 hours. After that, I file criminal charges and divorce papers simultaneously. You can explain to the police and the divorce court why you thought stealing was a better option than honest communication." He stared at me for a long moment, probably seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Not the compliant wife who handled his finances while he focused on more important things. Not the naive woman who could be manipulated into accepting whatever story he decided to tell. But the financial crimes investigator who'd been building a case against him for months. "I never thought you had it in you," he said quietly. "I know. That was your biggest mistake." Timothy didn't respond to my ultimatum within 24 hours. Instead, he hired a lawyer. I learned about this development when attorney Gerald Patterson called my office the following afternoon. "Mrs. Virginia, I represent your husband Timothy in the matter of your pending divorce. I understand there have been some accusations made that my client and I would like to address." Gerald's tone was smooth and professional, the voice of someone accustomed to negotiating settlements for wealthy clients who preferred to avoid public scandals. Timothy had probably told him some version of our story that painted me as a vindictive wife, making exaggerated claims about minor financial irregularities. "Mr. Patterson," I replied, "what accusations are you referring to?" "My client acknowledges that your marriage has encountered difficulties and that financial assets may need to be restructured as part of a divorce settlement. However, he categorically denies any criminal wrongdoing, and he's prepared to contest any attempt to characterize normal business practices as fraudulent activity." I almost smiled. Timothy had clearly presented himself as the victim of false accusations rather than a man caught red-handed committing multiple felonies. He was gambling that I wouldn't actually follow through on my threats, that I was bluffing about the quality and quantity of evidence I'd gathered. "Mr. Patterson, I think you may have been given incomplete information about the situation. Would it be possible for us to meet in person? I have documentation that might clarify some of the issues your client has described." We arranged to meet at Gerald's office the next morning. I spent the evening preparing a presentation that would demonstrate Timothy's criminal behavior so clearly that even a lawyer paid to defend him would have to acknowledge the strength of the evidence. Gerald's office was exactly what I'd expected. Dark wood paneling, leather furniture, law books arranged to suggest decades of successful practice. He was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and an expensive suit, someone who specialized in making problems disappear for clients who could afford discretion. Thank you for coming, Mrs. Virginia. I hope we can resolve this matter efficiently for everyone involved. I set my laptop in a folder of printed documents on his conference table. Mr. Patterson, before we discuss resolution, I think you need to understand what your client has actually done. I walked him through the same evidence I'd presented to Timothy. The timeline of the affair with Julia, the secret business and hidden bank accounts, the systematic theft from real estate clients, the attempted liquidation of marital assets while I was traveling. Gerald's expression shifted as I presented each piece of documentation. His initial confidence gave way to concern, then to obvious dismay. By the time I finished, he was studying the printed bank records with the focus of someone realizing his client had lied to him about fundamental facts. "This is quite extensive," he said finally. "My client characterized this as a dispute over asset division in a difficult divorce. Your client committed felony fraud against multiple victims over an extended period. The theft from marital assets was just the most recent crime in a pattern of criminal behavior." Gerald closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "What outcome are you seeking?" I outlined the same settlement terms I'd presented to Timothy. Full restitution to defrauded clients. Acceptance of a divorce agreement that left him with minimal assets. Cooperation with transferring hidden money back to legitimate accounts. In exchange, no criminal charges. "These terms are quite harsh," Gerald observed. "They're appropriate for someone who committed multiple felonies. The alternative is criminal prosecution, which would result in prison time and complete financial ruin." Gerald asked for time to consult with his client. I agreed to extend my deadline by another 48 hours, but I made it clear that this was the final extension. After that, I would proceed with criminal charges regardless of what Timothy decided. I left Gerald's office feeling confident that Timothy would eventually accept my terms. His lawyer had seen the evidence and understood that fighting criminal charges would be futile. No competent attorney would advise a client to risk years in prison over a divorce settlement, especially when the evidence was overwhelming. But Timothy surprised me again. Instead of accepting the settlement, he went on the offensive. I discovered his new strategy when I arrived home from work 2 days later to find police officers waiting in my driveway. Detective Sarah Morrison introduced herself and explained that Timothy had filed a complaint, alleging that I'd been engaging in illegal surveillance and making extortionate threats. "Mr. Timothy claims you've been monitoring his online activities without his consent and threatening to file false criminal charges unless he agrees to an unfair divorce settlement," Detective Morrison explained. "These are serious allegations that we need to investigate." I invited the detective inside and offered to show her the same evidence I'd presented to Gerald. "Detective Morrison, I'd like you to understand what actually happened here before deciding whether my husband's complaints have merit." I walked her through the timeline, the financial fraud, the attempted theft of marital assets. I showed her the legal documentation Elizabeth and I had prepared to protect our accounts. I explained that everything I'd done was designed to prevent criminal activity, not to facilitate it. Detective Morrison was thorough and professional. She examined my evidence carefully, asked detailed questions about my monitoring methods, and took notes on everything I presented. Unlike Gerald, she had experience with financial crimes and understood the significance of the digital trail Timothy had left. "Mrs. Virginia, based on what you've shown me, it appears your husband may have committed serious crimes. The surveillance methods you used are legally questionable in a marital context, but the evidence you gathered seems to document genuine criminal activity." She paused, reviewing her notes. "I'm going to need to interview your husband and examine the accounts he accessed. If your allegations are accurate, we'll be looking at charges for fraud, attempted theft, and possibly embezzlement." I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that law enforcement was taking Timothy's crimes seriously. Apprehension because criminal prosecution would make our situation much more complicated and public than I'd originally intended. "Detective Morrison, I want justice, but I also want resolution. If Timothy agrees to make full restitution and accept appropriate divorce terms, would the district attorney consider a plea agreement?" That would depend on the extent of the fraud and the cooperation of the victims. But yes, plea agreements are always possible when defendants take responsibility for their actions and make victims whole. After Detective Morrison left, I called Elizabeth to update her on this new development. Timothy's decision to involve law enforcement had backfired spectacularly. Instead of casting doubt on my credibility, he'd invited official scrutiny of his criminal behavior. "This actually strengthens our position," Elizabeth told me. "Now that there's an active police investigation, Timothy can't claim you're making empty threats. He's looking at real criminal charges with serious consequences." That evening, Gerald called me directly. "Mrs. Virginia, my client would like to reconsider your settlement proposal. Recent developments have clarified certain aspects of this situation." "What developments are those, Mr. Patterson?" "My client acknowledges that some of his business practices may have been inappropriate. He's willing to discuss making restitution to affected parties and accepting modified divorce terms." Timothy was trying to negotiate from a position of weakness, while pretending he still had leverage. He'd gone from denying everything to acknowledging inappropriate business practices, legal speak for admitting to crimes while avoiding explicitly incriminating language. "The settlement terms haven't changed," I told Gerald. "Full restitution, asset forfeiture, cooperation with authorities. Those are still the only conditions under which I'll agree to support a plea arrangement. My client feels these terms are punitive rather than restorative. Your client committed felonies against multiple victims. Punitive consequences are appropriate." Gerald asked for another extension to discuss options with Timothy. I refused. "Mr. Patterson, your client has had multiple opportunities to resolve this matter. Tomorrow morning, I'm providing all my evidence to Detective Morrison and requesting formal criminal charges. After that, any plea negotiations will have to go through the district attorney's office." Timothy had made his choice. He'd decided to fight rather than accept responsibility for his actions. Now he would face the full consequences of that decision. The district attorney's office moved quickly once Detective Morrison submitted her report. Within a week, Timothy was facing formal charges for fraud, attempted theft, and embezzlement. The local newspaper picked up the story, running a front-page article about a prominent real estate broker accused of stealing from clients and attempting to liquidate marital assets during a divorce. Timothy's professional reputation was destroyed overnight. His brokerage firm immediately suspended him pending the outcome of the criminal case. 3 of his major clients filed civil lawsuits seeking damages for the money he'd stolen from their transactions. The State Real Estate Commission opened an investigation that would likely result in the permanent revocation of his license. Julia, his assistant and lover, was also charged as an accessory to fraud. Prosecutors had evidence that she'd helped Timothy manipulate client accounts and had been aware of his plans to steal marital assets. Their romantic relationship, which had seemed so important to Timothy that he'd been willing to destroy his marriage for it, crumbled under the pressure of facing criminal charges together. I watched these developments unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction, because Timothy was finally facing consequences for his choices. Sadness, because the man I'd loved for 12 years had turned out to be someone capable of betraying everyone who trusted him. Elizabeth filed our divorce papers, while Timothy was dealing with his criminal charges. With his reputation destroyed and his assets frozen pending restitution orders, he was in no position to contest our proposed settlement. He agreed to everything: minimal asset retention, full cooperation with asset recovery, and acknowledgement that his attempted theft had forfeited any claim to marital property. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. Timothy pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for making full restitution to his victims and accepting a suspended sentence with probation. He avoided prison time, but his career in real estate was over, his financial resources were exhausted, and his relationship with Julia had ended when she blamed him for involving her in his criminal schemes. I moved forward with rebuilding my life. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about trust, preparation, and the importance of protecting yourself when people you love prove they're not worthy of that love. I'd emerged from the situation financially secure and professionally strengthened, but emotionally changed by the discovery of how thoroughly Timothy had deceived me. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected phone call from Gerald, Timothy's former attorney. "Mrs. Virginia, I'm calling to inform you that Timothy has filed for bankruptcy. He wanted you to know that he's lost everything, and that he hopes you're satisfied with the outcome." Mr. Patterson, I was never trying to destroy Timothy's life. I was trying to protect myself and his victims from further harm. If he'd chosen honesty over deception, we could have ended our marriage without destroying his career or his financial future. He realizes that now. Unfortunately, that realization came too late to prevent the consequences of his earlier choices. I hung up feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Part of me felt vindicated that Timothy finally understood the magnitude of his mistakes. Part of me felt genuinely sad that a man who'd once been capable of love and partnership had made choices that led to the complete destruction of his life. But mostly, I felt grateful that I'd trusted my instincts and prepared for the worst-case scenario. The financial safeguards I'd constructed had protected not just my assets, but also the assets of Timothy's clients, who might never have recovered their stolen money if I hadn't documented his crimes so thoroughly. I also felt proud of how I'd handled an impossible situation. When I'd discovered my husband's betrayal, I could have reacted emotionally, confronting him immediately, making threats I wasn't prepared to follow through on, or simply accepting his version of events and agreeing to an unfair divorce settlement. Instead, I'd responded strategically. I'd gathered evidence methodically. I'd protected my interests proactively. I'd offered Timothy opportunities to resolve our situation with minimal consequences. And when he'd chosen to escalate rather than cooperate, I'd been prepared to follow through on my warnings. The experience had changed my relationship with trust and vulnerability. I'd learned that loving someone doesn't mean accepting their bad behavior, and that preparing for betrayal isn't cynical, it's responsible. I'd also learned that the skills I'd developed in my professional life were directly applicable to protecting myself in personal situations. Most importantly, I'd learned that I was stronger and more resourceful than I'd realized. For years, I'd seen myself as someone who worked behind the scenes while Timothy handled the more visible aspects of our life together. I'd deferred to his expertise in real estate decisions, and had been content to let him be the public face of our partnership. The crisis had forced me to step into a leadership role and manage a complex situation that required legal knowledge, financial expertise, emotional resilience, and strategic thinking. I discovered that I was capable of all of those things, and that realization had given me confidence to pursue opportunities I might have been too intimidated to consider before. I decided to start my own financial consulting firm, specializing in helping people protect their assets during relationship transitions. My experience with Timothy had taught me how many ways a deceptive partner could manipulate shared finances, and I wanted to help other people avoid becoming victims of similar betrayals. The business grew quickly. Word spread through the legal community about my work on my own case, and attorneys began referring clients who needed help documenting financial abuse or protecting assets during contentious divorces. I developed specialized techniques for tracking hidden accounts, identifying fraudulent transactions, and creating legal barriers that prevented one spouse from unilaterally liquidating marital assets. Within 2 years, I had a waiting list of clients and was training other financial professionals in the methods I'd pioneered. The work was rewarding both financially and emotionally. I was helping people navigate some of the most difficult situations in their lives, and I was using skills that might have remained dormant if Timothy hadn't forced me to defend myself. I never remarried, but I did develop meaningful relationships with partners who understood and respected my independence. I'd learned the difference between healthy interdependence and the kind of unbalanced dynamic that had characterized my marriage with Timothy. I was no longer willing to be anyone's silent partner or behind-the-scenes support system. Looking back on the confrontation with Timothy, I realized that his attempt to steal our assets had been a gift, even though it hadn't felt like one at the time. His betrayal had forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed, and had given me clarity about what I wanted from my life going forward. Timothy had tried to reduce me to a victim of his schemes, someone who would discover his betrayal too late to prevent the financial damage he'd planned to inflict. Instead, His deception had revealed that I was actually the architect of my own security, someone capable of building structures that could withstand even the most deliberate attempts at destruction. He'd thought he was declaring war on a queen who inherited her power from their marriage. Instead, he'd challenged an architect who had designed every aspect of the fortress he was trying to attack. The courier who delivered Timothy's message at the London airport had looked stunned when I'd laughed at the news that the castle was under new management. He'd probably expected tears or panic, not confidence and amusement. But I'd known something Timothy didn't understand. You can't take over a castle when the architect still holds all the blueprints. 2 years after our divorce was finalized, Timothy made one final attempt to reclaim some dignity from the wreckage of his life. He filed a motion with the family court claiming that I had used illegal surveillance methods to gather evidence against him, and that our divorce settlement should be overturned based on procedural violations. His new attorney, a young public defender named Jacob who clearly didn't understand the full scope of what had happened, argued that Timothy's constitutional rights had been violated by my monitoring of his online activities. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March. I arrived at the courthouse with Elizabeth and a complete file of documentation about Timothy's criminal behavior, including the restitution payments he'd made to his defrauded clients and the plea agreement he'd signed acknowledging his guilt. Timothy looked different. Thinner, older, wearing a suit that had seen better days. He'd lost the confident bearing that had once made him successful in real estate negotiations. 2 years of criminal prosecution, financial ruin, and social disgrace had hollowed him out in ways that were visible even across a crowded courtroom. Judge Catherine Williams had reviewed all the case files before the hearing. She was a veteran family court judge with a reputation for cutting through legal nonsense and focusing on practical outcomes. I could tell from her expression that she was not impressed with Timothy's motion. "Mr. Timothy," Judge Williams began, "you're asking this court to overturn a divorce settlement that you voluntarily agreed to, based on claims that your ex-wife violated your privacy while she was documenting your criminal activity. Is that correct?" Timothy's attorney stood to respond. "Your Honor, our position is that the surveillance methods used were illegal under state privacy laws, and that any evidence gathered through those methods should be excluded from consideration. Mr. Jacob, are you aware that your client pleaded guilty to fraud charges based on the same evidence you're now claiming was illegally obtained?" "Yes, Your Honor, but we believe the criminal case was resolved under duress." Judge Williams cut him off. "Mr. Jacob, your client wasn't under duress. He was facing the consequences of committing multiple felonies. The evidence against him was overwhelming, regardless of how it was obtained." She turned her attention to Timothy directly. "Mr. Timothy, you had an affair with your assistant. You stole money from your real estate clients. You attempted to liquidate marital assets while your wife was out of the country. You lied to attorneys and law enforcement officers. Is there any part of that summary you'd like to dispute?" Timothy stood slowly. "Your Honor, I made mistakes." "You committed crimes, Mr. Timothy. Multiple felonies that harmed innocent people who trusted you professionally and personally." The judge reviewed the settlement documents. "Your ex-wife offered you an opportunity to avoid criminal prosecution in exchange for making restitution and accepting reasonable divorce terms. You chose to fight those terms and ended up facing criminal charges anyway. Now you want this court to reward your poor judgment by giving you a second chance at divorce negotiations?" Timothy's attorney tried to interrupt, but Judge Williams continued. "Furthermore, you're asking me to ignore the fact that your ex-wife's actions protected not just her own interests, but also the interests of your clients who were being defrauded. Her documentation of your criminal behavior led to restitution payments that might never have been recovered otherwise." I watched Timothy's face as the judge spoke. He looked like a man finally understanding that his actions had consequences that couldn't be negotiated away or appealed to a higher authority. The courtroom was a place where facts mattered more than charm or manipulation, and the facts were overwhelmingly against him. "Motion denied," Judge Williams concluded. "The divorce settlement stands as originally agreed. Mr. Timothy, you've wasted this court's time with a frivolous filing that demonstrates you still haven't accepted responsibility for the choices that led to your current situation." As we left the courthouse, Timothy approached me in the parking lot. He looked defeated, older than his years, carrying himself like someone who'd finally run out of options and schemes. Virginia, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted to apologize. For everything. For the affair. For trying to steal our money. For the way I treated you during our marriage. I realize now that you were always the strong one, and I was too stupid and selfish to appreciate what I had. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or false sincerity. Instead, I saw genuine regret, and what looked like actual understanding of how thoroughly he'd destroyed his own life. Timothy, I appreciate the apology, but you should know that I don't need it for my own peace of mind. I resolved my feelings about our marriage a long time ago. He nodded slowly. I know. I can see that you've moved on and built something better. I just wanted you to know that I understand how wrong I was about everything. I drove home from the courthouse feeling a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Timothy's final legal challenge had been his last attempt to avoid taking full responsibility for his choices, and its complete failure seemed to have broken something in him that had been holding on to denial and blame. For the first time since our confrontation began, he'd looked at me and seen who I actually was, rather than who he'd imagined me to be. He'd finally understood that I wasn't a victim of his schemes, but an architect who'd been building protective structures while he was planning his betrayal. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing the financial reports for my consulting firm. The business had grown beyond my original expectations, serving clients across the Pacific Northwest and expanding into online services for people dealing with financial abuse in other states. What had started as a response to my own crisis had become a way to help hundreds of people protect themselves from similar betrayals. My phone rang around 8 p.m. Elizabeth's name appeared on the caller ID. Virginia, I thought you'd want to know. Timothy's attorney called my office this afternoon. Timothy has decided to leave Seattle. He's moving to Oregon to work for his brother's landscaping company. Apparently, he wanted to make sure you knew he wouldn't be around to cause any more problems. I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that Timothy was finally accepting reality and removing himself from my life completely. Sadness that a man who'd once had so much potential had reduced himself to running away from the consequences of his own choices. Thank you for letting me know, I told Elizabeth. I hope he finds some peace in Oregon. I hope he finds some perspective. You know, Virginia, in 30 years of family law practice, I've never seen someone handle a situation like yours with such strategic clarity. Most people in your position either react emotionally and make things worse, or they let themselves be victimized because they're afraid of confrontation. I had good training for crisis management. My work in financial crimes investigation taught me to think systematically about complex problems. It was more than professional training. You had the emotional strength to see clearly when someone you loved was betraying you, and the courage to protect yourself even when it meant destroying your marriage. After we hung up, I thought about Elizabeth's words. The experience with Timothy had taught me things about myself that I might never have discovered in a stable, honest relationship. I'd learned that I could be ruthless when necessary, strategic under pressure, and resilient in the face of profound betrayal. But I'd also learned that strength and compassion weren't mutually exclusive. Protecting myself from Timothy's schemes hadn't required me to become vindictive or cruel. I'd offered him multiple opportunities to resolve our situation with minimal consequences, and when he'd chosen to escalate rather than cooperate, I'd followed through on my warnings without taking pleasure in his downfall. The vindication I felt wasn't about seeing Timothy suffer. It was about proving to myself that I could handle whatever challenges life presented. I'd faced a situation that could have destroyed me financially and emotionally, and I'd not only survived it, but emerged stronger and more confident than before. My consulting firm continued to grow. My personal relationships were healthier and more balanced, and I'd discovered professional fulfillment I'd never experienced while living in Timothy's shadow. The crisis he'd created by trying to steal our assets had ultimately freed me to become the person I was meant to be. Timothy spent the following years working manual labor for his brother's company, living in a small apartment in Portland, and slowly paying off the debts his criminal behavior had created. Julia left Oregon within 6 months of arriving, unable to find work in her field and unwilling to associate with someone whose reputation had been destroyed by fraud charges. Timothy's former colleagues in real estate treated him as a cautionary tale, and his name became synonymous with professional betrayal throughout the Seattle business community. He never remarried, never rebuilt his career, and spent the remainder of his life as a reminder of how quickly success can turn to ruin when someone chooses deception over integrity. Looking back now, I understand that Timothy's betrayal was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because I enjoyed watching him suffer the consequences of his choices, but because his attempt to destroy me revealed strengths I never knew I possessed.